Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the fourth talk in the series Spotlight on IFAS Research. Today we have a very special speaker who is Dr. Adefbola Adesogan. He is an Associate Vice President and Director of the Global Food Systems Institute at IFAS at University of Florida. He is also the E.T. and Vam York Professor of International Agriculture. His research interests include including forage quality and preservation, nutritional enhancement of animal performance, and using animal source foods to improve human nutrition, health, and livelihoods. He earned his bachelor's, master's from University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and his PhD from Reading in the UK. He has received over $70 million in grant funding, published over 160 journal papers and book chapters, given over 100 invited seminars, and has received several awards, which he has been too modest to tell me about. So I don't know what they were. Maybe he'll tell me what the awards were. So please welcome Dr. Adesogan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pushpa. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to share a little bit of the work that we've been doing over the last 7 years with you. And if you look at the top of the slide, you will see that it says Feed the Future. And Feed the Future is the US government's global initiative to tackle poverty and hunger in the developing world. It's an across-government initiative that includes several different government agencies, and it has passed with bipartisan support repeatedly in Congress. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about global food and nutrition security. And this is partly because we've been working in this area for the last 7 years. So I'll start by talking about global malnutrition, what has happened over the last few years and where we are now. I'll talk about animal source foods and why we focus so much on them. And then I'll give some examples of the types of projects we have been working on with the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab. And I'll finish with the Global Food Systems Institute, which is a relatively new institute that is taking on the work of the lab and expanding the scope and the impacts. Okay, so over 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. And so these are really sobering statistics. Over 800 million are regularly hungry. And almost 150 million children are stunted. And this stunting makes them much more likely to die in infancy, about 45% increase in likelihood. And so these under fives will come back and talk about this problem of stunting. But then at the same time, in many parts of the world, a lot of the children are overweight. And then some of them are wasted. So stunting is chronic malnutrition. We know what overweight, wasting is acute malnutrition, and we know what overweight is. When we look at the trends over the last 20 years, we see this is the metric here for stunting. There's been quite a decline in stunting over the years, which is fantastic. Same thing for wasting. The slope is a lot less steep, but there's been a decrease. But the challenge is that there's still a lot of kids who are overweight. So these metrics here are indices of a hidden hunger, where the children or the people are eating enough, but they're not getting the right nourishment because of a deficiency in specific nutrients. So the hunger issues are affected by levels of poverty, particularly. One of the biggest issues is that in the developing world, people cannot afford nutrient-dense food items. Governance, corruption is a big issue. Demographic conditions. Then there are also shocks. So COVID was a tremendous shock. The Ukraine crisis amplified that shock because fertilizer prices tripled in many of the countries. So people could not afford to buy fertilizers to improve productivity. And then there are other issues like climate change. And in some of the areas that are neediest in terms of food security in the world, these are conflict areas as well. So there are intertribal wars and so on, which are really aggravating the situation. So I'll zero in a little bit on stunting. And stunting is chronic malnutrition. It's one of those that often goes unnoticed. And so it kills about 45% of children under 5. And as I said earlier, about 150 million children worldwide are affected. And stunting is measured when children's height is plugged on a chart that the World Health Organization developed, and when the height does not measure up to what it should be based on that chart. Now, it looks like it's just an indication of impaired height, but it's also masks a more severe condition, which is impaired brain development. So the children who are stunted have impaired brain development, and they're not able to do well in school. They're not able to live as productive lives because their brains are impaired. And when you have those people in the workforce, the World Bank says that the GDP, the economic productivity of a nation, can be impacted by up to 16%. So this is a personal problem. It's also a community problem. It's also intergenerational, as shown here. So a stunted child, when that child becomes a mother, it's more likely that her children will be stunted. And the sobering thing is that in parts of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in 3 children is stunted. And these children are also much more susceptible to diseases. So this graph here shows the global prevalence of wasting, which is acute malnutrition, acute undernutrition. And you can see here that areas of India, South Asia, and India in particular, and some of the African countries are some of the worst hit. But Asia is where wasting is worst. And then here is stunting. And stunting, this is the acute form, this is the chronic form. You can see that a lot more of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in Asia, are affected by this problem of stunting. When we look at another problem to do with malnutrition, this is anemia. Of course, this is a problem here in the US as well with many, many women. But the hotspots, the global hotspots, again, are in areas of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And in this graph here, we have some of the countries where malnutrition is most, iron deficiency is most prevalent. So Rwanda, Albania, Madagascar, and then at this end, we have Nigeria, which is where I come from originally, and Mauritania, Mali. So a lot of African countries, but also Asian countries, is where these problems are most prevalent. Now, one of the main reasons for the prevalence, the high prevalence of these problems in these areas is the diet. And when you look at the proportion of plant foods to animal foods that are consumed in these parts of the world, you find that the proportion of animal source foods, and I'll use the acronym ASF for them, is lowest, the proportion in the diet is lowest in South Asia and in Africa relative to other parts of the world, and even compared to the average value for the whole world. And so in many of these, in Africa and Asian countries, a lot of people are vegetarians, not because they choose to be, but because they are forced to be, because those foods are also some of the most expensive items, but also there are taboos against consumption of these animal source foods. For instance, in Ethiopia, people will fast up to 250 days a year. A lot of the Orthodox Christians will fast for that long, and fasting is avoiding animal source foods. So there are taboos in some parts of Africa. There are taboos about meat consumption, about egg consumption, about milk consumption that restrict consumption of these important foods. And this graph here just shows the consumption of dairy products and just the stark difference in amounts consumed in different parts of the world. So this is Democratic Republic of Congo, and that's about a liter a person a year. And in most of sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 30. Whereas in Sweden and Finland, it's about 10 times what you have in South Asia and in most of Africa. So there are stark differences in the levels of consumption. And this is true of fish, this is true of meat, this is true of eggs, of all the animal source foods to different extents. Why are these foods important? Well, one of the primary reasons is the protein concentration and quality. And so this measure here, the digestible amino acid score, you don't need to worry about the name or anything. It's just a measure of the quality of protein, which is indicated by the profile of amino acids and how digestible, how available those amino acids are. And you find here that the proteins from dairy, beef, pork have much higher scores compared to the plant protein sources, which are down here. And these are some of the best. Even soy protein, pea protein don't quite measure up to the animal proteins. And in fact, the more of the plant protein you have in the diet, the less this score, which is used by nutritionists to denote protein quality. And so this table here shows a list of different micronutrients that are advantageous and where animal source foods have an edge over plant source foods. I talked about the protein, but then there are things like iron, zinc, calcium, vitamin A, choline, vitamin D, and there are several others. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, where the animal sources are the natural source and they are more bioavailable. And if we're thinking of bioavailability, that's a very important metric for infants that are growing either in the womb or in the first 1,000 days of life, because those brains are still small, they are still being formed, and they need a very ready supply of micronutrients for proper development of the brain. To illustrate the difference in availability of the micronutrients, I've just chosen iron in this slide. And this shows different food types here. So we have everything from haddock up here. We've got prawns and sausages, we've got butter beans. And then down here, we have hazelnuts, almonds. And what's interesting is if you look at the concentrations, that you can rank the food types according to the concentrations. And that's what we often look at. But a more important metric to look at, as well as the concentration, is how much of it can be absorbed. And that's a measure of the bioavailability. And when you look at that metric, it's the animal source foods. So it's the salmon, the bacon, the pork, and so on that have the edge. Those are the purple. Bars that you can see in this chart. And so this is just an illustration of how these animal source foods are more bioavailable. These are polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are very important in many processes, including in brain development. Vitamin A, fatty acids, iron, zinc, they're all more bioavailable in these animal source foods than in the plant source foods. Now remember that in most of the world, their diets in those vulnerable areas in Africa and South Asia, the diets are predominantly plant-based. And so they lack, even if they're eating foods that contain some of these micronutrients, because they're not as bioavailable, they are compromised in their dietary status. To illustrate that point a little bit more, this graph here shows the amounts of different food types that are needed to supply the iron needs of a pregnant young lady. Sorry, of a woman, not necessarily pregnant. And so you can see that this is about 5 pounds of spinach would be needed, although spinach is a good source. And I don't know how many of you would eat 5 pounds of spinach, okay? So it's showing that relative to the animal sources, which are here, there's a lot less, the density and the bioavailability of the animal source foods is so much greater that they can supply the iron needs much more readily. We think about the brain development of an infant. One of the things that is important to mention is that 90% of the brain growth is completed by the time that child is born. So two-thirds of the DNA is formed, two-thirds of the DNA is formed by the time the child is born, and then the brain growth is completed within about the first 1,000 days. These are a number of processes, so visual processing, auditory processing, these take place very early in birth. These processes here, myelination, synaptogenesis, these are important processes in formation of the nervous system and development of components of that system. This brain volume is a measure of cognition that's used in many studies. And so what you can see is that there's a lot of important development of the brain taking place early. And several critical micronutrients and macronutrients are important for developing the brain. So the protein is important for cell proliferation. This is for development of the synapses between the neurons in the brain. The iron is important for the myelin sheath that surrounds the neurons. And we can go on and just pick out different nutrients and micronutrients and how they play a critical role in brain formation. So when they're lacking, the IQ of the child is lower and their ability to do well in school is reduced. So I'm going to turn to a few studies that have tried to address this problem of stunting with animal source foods. And this is a study which was done in Ecuador that looked at what happens when you add just an egg a day to the diets of children. And these were children who were 6 to 9 months old. And over a 6-month period, they just got 1 egg a day. And compared to children in the control group, stunting was reduced by about 47%. So this was chronic undernutrition. Wasting, which is acute undernutrition, was reduced by 74%. So these are the biggest reductions on record, and those were achieved by just giving a child 1 egg a day. This is another study which was done in Kenya this time, and this time with school children who are aged 7 to 10 years old. And what was done was to supplement their basal diet, which was beans and corn, and supplement that with a matchbox size of meat or a cup of milk, or they gave them some oil to provide extra energy in the diet. And they looked at the baseline scores, their test scores at the baseline, and their test scores after a 2-year period averaged across all their school subjects. And what they found was a 45% increase in the test scores for those who got meat, a 28% increase for those who got the milk, and those who got the energy, the oil, there was no increase relative to the baseline, and this was the control. So this was one of the first studies showing how what you feed a child can affect their performance in school. And in many of the African and Asian countries, if a child does not do well in school, their chances of going on to have a very productive and impactful life are severely compromised. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about this project that we started on about 2015. We got a significant amount of funding from the US Agency for International Development and the Gates Foundation to establish what is called the Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. These are partnerships between US universities and scientists, governments, private sector people in the developing world that tackle global malnutrition. So there are about 20 of these labs, and ours is the livestock lab. And we were focused on using these animal source foods to improve nutrition and improving livestock production. So we've worked in over 10 countries over the years. We've managed over 60 different projects in these countries. And some of the countries are shown here. Several of them are in Africa, but Nepal and Cambodia have also been, and we've also worked in Sri Lanka. And so I'll show you a few slides that demonstrate the types of results, type of work that we have been doing in the countries. So in Ethiopia, one of the big issues in all these countries, in fact, when we traveled to all the countries, we brought geneticists, we brought nutritionists, we brought vets, brought them all together, dietitians, and said, what's the biggest constraint to livestock production and consumption of these animal source foods? They said it's the lack of enough feed of the right quality. Our animals are hungry, starving sometimes, and even when they are not starving, their diets are very poor. And so this is one of our surveys in Ethiopia, in the different parts of Ethiopia, just looking at how much feed is available for livestock, how much is required. So purple would be the figures showing how much is available. Green is what is required, and the balance is what is needed. In all the different areas, there was a deficit of feed throughout the whole country. Okay? And this is true of many of the countries where we work. And feed is one of the biggest costs of livestock production. It can account for up to 70% of the costs. So when feed costs are high, the costs of meat and milk and eggs are high, and it makes those things unaffordable. So some of the things we did is we brought in improved fodder varieties from Florida, from Brazil, that would grow under those conditions, and we introduced them, and we planted them at different sites, and we validated them through agronomy studies over several years. And this here is what they normally grow here, but you can see that the yield increased when we used the introduced varieties. So we had higher yields, we had more protein, and they were more digestible compared to the standard that is typically used in the country. And we did this in a number of different countries. And the governments have now accepted these. They have been registered, and they're now releasing them for use to improve productivity. Another thing is that we created a database to inventory what types of feed are available in the country, as well as what is being brought in, so that people can have an idea of what resources they have and how best to use them. So this is now showing the types of feeds that are available, whether it's energy-dense feeds, browses, which are short trees that the animals can graze on. You see there's a camel there, so in that context, camels are also important livestock. They have byproducts, and in many of the countries, they don't use byproducts, things like brewery wastes, which are excellent animal source foods, excellent feeds for animals. We did a bunch of different other studies, but I won't go into them. But one of the things we also did was we developed apps for determining the best recipes, the best ways in which to combine different ingredients and to formulate the most nourishing diets for animals. And so this is one that was developed in Nepali. This is one developed in Amharic, in the Ethiopian language. And this allows them to formulate diets that improve livestock productivity, decrease waste, and reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. We also did studies to look at what happens when you feed these improved diets relative to when you introduce improved genetics. So the green bars here, these are 3 different regions of Ethiopia. The red bars are the controls. The greens is artificial insemination of Holstein cow with Holstein genetics to improve the genetic merit of the cows. And then here we had improved feeding of those high genetic merit cows. And we saw almost a 30% increase in milk production from the cows when we fed them the improved diets when we looked across the board. We also worked on disease surveillance because they have terrible diseases of livestock. Some of those diseases can infect people. So we did a lot of training of people to recognize diseases. This is a manual that we created that was then translated into all the local languages in Ethiopia to help them to better detect and mitigate livestock diseases. So this was done in Ethiopia, but also in Nepal and a number of places. The government told us that the mortality, death of young livestock, was one of the most severe problems they were facing. They would lose a high percentage of the animals. So again, these are different parts of the country, and these are the baseline scores, and these are the end line scores. So we introduced interventions that reduced mortality in these animals across different regions. This is data just for calves, but we did this for sheep, camels, just a whole range of different species. And how did we do it? Well, we detected that some of the mortality was due to infection from things like bacteria, and so we introduced measures to control the bacteria, but they also had taboos on feeding the colostrum, which is the first milk that is produced by the dam, the cow, and which is rich in immune factors that boost the health of the newborn. And they were throwing this away, believing that it's something that you shouldn't feed to the animals. So we're able to educate them and help them understand the vital importance of this in the diet. Another aspect of the work that we did was trying to connect those who needed feed with those who are selling the feed. So in this case, we discovered that this is in Niger, one of the poorest countries in the world, and it's in West Africa. We discovered that there were feed suppliers in a part of the country that were looking for a market and were producing and could not have enough market. But there were people who needed feed about 500 miles away around the capital. And so by bringing these people together, we're able to get the feed producers to start supplying the feed, hauling the feed, and supplying it to those who needed it near the capital. And because of this, those who needed it near the capital were able to buy the feed for a much lower price, 30% less, and consequently, people like this lady here were able to increase the growth of their animals because they were fed better. And so she was able to improve her well-being, the livelihoods of her family members in that way. We also developed this app, which helps smallholders, poor people, identify the best markets for their livestock products. In this case, this was goats in Nepal. And so in many cases, the poor people would have to trek their animals, sometimes 10 miles, 20 miles. They get the animals to the market. They're at the mercy of the market sellers. Those folks fix the prices. And if they don't accept the price, then they have to take the animal all the way back. And so they're at the mercy of those people. And this app helps to determine or to tell them what the market prices are before they leave their homes. And so they can choose the best places to market their produce. We also had some food safety projects, and this is just one example. In Ethiopia, the government has determined that one of the ways they will improve the nutrition of people is by increasing poultry consumption significantly. The challenge is that in many instances, this is what they have. So they have the birds roaming around the background, the homestead, around the home with children. And the children sometimes pick up, you know how kids are, they pick up the droppings and ingest them. And when they do, they intake pathogens that cause gut inflammation of the gut. And that compromises absorption of nutrients. So even if you are feeding them properly, they're not absorbing them. They have diarrhea and so on. So in this part of Ethiopia, our colleagues, Ari, who led this, he showed that the incidence of this gut inflammation was about 50%. He had a theory that one of the main pathogens was Campylobacter. He found a high incidence of this Campylobacter. And what he also did is found that there were two main strains. One that was transmitted between humans, the sea infants, and then another one that was transmitted from the chickens. And they also discovered that there were a number of practices that predisposed to greater prevalence of this gut inflammation problem. Things like not washing hands. They found that higher incidences were associated with breastfeeding. And it was not so much the breastfeeding per se, was that the mothers were not washing their hands, or the kids had picked up, the pathogens from the environment and were holding on to the mother's breast. And so there was that kind of cycling going on. And so here is some of the work that he did that was just showing as the child was growing, there were greater and greater levels of prevalence, exposure to this pathogen. So they're also developing control strategies. This is the last of the studies I will mention about our work with the livestock lab. Then I'm going to transition to some of the work that we're doing more generally at the university. So this work was done among a tribe in Burkina Faso. It's a French-speaking West African country. And we targeted a tribe where people raise poultry, but they sell the eggs for income. Egg consumption, particularly among children, is frowned on. And in fact, they say things like if a child eats eggs, that child would learn to steal. And the reason for that is that, an egg is a precious thing to that child. And so they feel that if children learn to, take precious things and take it for granted, they're going to become thieves when they grow up. So they don't allow them to eat eggs. And what we wanted to do was to change this ideology. And we worked with the village elder. So we targeted them first and we asked them to allow us to give these poor families 3 chickens on the condition that they would buy 1 more so that they have skin in the game. And then secondly, they would feed an egg a day to an infant, okay? And so they helped us select the families that committed to do that. And we started the trial. And so our full intervention was giving them chickens and then providing training on how to best raise the chickens and also the importance of eggs in the diet. So we put the women, we formed different women's cooperative groups. We're teaching them, we had a jingle and got them together quite regularly to reinforce the message. And then we had a partial intervention, which was just training without gifting of chickens. And at the end of 10 months, what we found was that those in the control group were eating no eggs. They were still eating no eggs at the end of the 10 months. Those in the partial group were eating 2 eggs on average, okay? Those in the full intervention group were eating 6 eggs. So this was very gratifying. This made the national news in the country that just feeding an egg a day can help. We can improve the nutrition of our children. And we actually measured a statistical decrease in wasting, which is acute malnutrition among the children. And so now we're looking at ways to scale this across the country, and we're doing other similar trials in other countries. Another thing to mention is that these are patriarchal societies, and what the man says goes. But when the women saw that their children, the health, the viability of their kids was improving so dramatically with the eggs, they refused when their husband said, we need to start selling these eggs. They said, no, it's making such a difference. We must continue feeding the eggs. Okay, so that's the work we've been doing across the world. And because of the impacts and of the work that we had been doing, the university asked us to establish this institute and to broaden the scope and impacts of what we're doing beyond livestock, to look at other nutrient-dense foods and how can we contribute to global food security. So I will tell you some of the ongoing efforts, some of the faculty who have joined us, and some of the new efforts that we are embarking on, and then I'll finish. So this institute aims to engage in developing solutions to address nutritional health and livelihood issues, particularly in the global south. That's our main focus. And we started with about 18 faculty. Now we have about 150 across different disciplines. So what I'm going to tell you is just snapshots to give you just an idea of what some of our different faculty are working. So this is something that we're really proud of. It's a crop modeling tool that was developed at UF to look at how can we model or predict the effects of fertilizer application or irrigation or climate change or soil nutrient depletion, all these different factors. How can we predict how they affect the yield of crops? And so they developed this program called the DSAT tool, And now it's used for over 42 different crops. And it's used by 25,000 people in almost 200 countries across the world. And so it's something that's really making a difference and helping smallholder farmers and governments in all over. And this is just a spattering of some of the areas where it was used. And this was downloaded earlier this year, showing where this is being used. Our faculty have also developed this seed system toolbox. And so the faculty who leads this with some other partners outside UF is a plant pathologist. And so they're looking at providing improved seeds of roots and tuber crops. So things like bananas and potatoes and yams. And these are the bulk of the diets. When I said earlier that the diets of people in those countries are mainly plant-based, so these are the things that they predominantly consume. And so this is looking at how can we introduce these seed systems into these countries? How can we monitor how well they're working? How can we check if they're getting diseased? How can we look at the efficacy? And so they've introduced this, they just published this in the last few months, and people all over the world are beginning to use this now. We also have a lot of faculty working on climate change and how to make crops more climate resilient and animals more climate resilient. And in the developing world, they experience very severe ravages, flooding, droughts, extreme temperature fluctuations, which are sudden and very devastating. So we have faculty studying effects of heat stress. And in this case, this is showing the gametes of rice affected. This is heat stress. This is the control. This is the ear here, and you can see reduced fertility. You can see reduced seed size here due to heat stress. So faculty are not only measuring and monitoring what the higher temperatures can do, but they're also running breeding programs that are developing more drought tolerant, more heat tolerant varieties for use in these developing countries. AI is also a very big component of what our faculty are doing, so artificial intelligence, and they're using it for better detection of mineral deficiency so that crops can be better fertilized, of identifying diseases, so this is citrus greening using AI, of determining which fruits are ready to be harvested, of looking at broccoli, things like broccoli and how well will it remain stable and the shelf life. And so you can see some early indications of spoilage as they use the AI. And then things like weed growth and precise application of fertilizers. We also have faculty who are working on invasive pests. And this is a colleague, Oscar Liebert, who was in Antigua a few months ago to look at this specific pest of okra called the okra leafhopper. And what he discovered was that this pest is already very prevalent in many parts of the Caribbean, and it does pose a threat to us here in Florida. And if it comes here, it will not only attack our okra, but it will also attack cotton. So it can be very devastating. And so he's deploying IPM, integrated pest management strategies to control this disease and keep it out in the country. We have faculty who've been developing indices for measuring the sustainability of aquaculture production systems, which is really vital because now aquaculture is increasing in relation to wild fish operations. And so this is very important. We have faculty who are working on circularity. How can we avoid wasting so much food and incorporate, reuse, recycle some of the food so that we don't have those issues with filling up landfills and greenhouse gas emissions. We have faculty working on fortification, but not just fortification of cereals, but how can we monitor the efficacy of dissemination of those fortified materials. So this is a faculty member who developed a tool, an app that can be used with a smartphone just to measure how much iron is in rice, how much iron has been added to rice. So these are examples of some of the work that our faculty are doing. And last year, we got about $11 million in grants. This is one grant which was targeted, involves collaboration with Brazil, and it's targeting how can we better use fertilizer. The fertilizer recommendations here in Florida that are used by our farmers are over 30 years old. And so how can we have more precise fertilization of the crops? Location-based recommendations. So that's what these guys are doing. We have a faculty member here who got some money with us to train African farmers, African scientists on best approaches for fertilizer use, for livestock production, for forage production, for crop production, and so on. And then this is the last one I'll show, another project here that is looking at sensors for measuring how well animals are consuming feed. So this is an air tag and a bolus, a sensor that goes into the stomach of the cow that allows you to measure how much methane it's emitting, how much feed it's consuming when the cow goes on heat, so that we can improve the productivity of the animal. So that's just some examples of the work our faculty are doing, and I'm going to conclude by saying global undernutrition has decreased, which is the good news. But the bad news is that the levels that are prevalent in Africa and Asia are still way too high. Animal source foods, in the West here, there is a push for us to consume less livestock products. But in many parts of Africa and Asia, they need to consume more. It's not just, we need to focus on the animal source foods, but also on the plant foods, because what is predominantly consumed is nutrient poor. It is calorie rich, but nutrient poor. And we need to look at things like fortification. We need to look at preservation, climate adaptation, food safety, and our institute is working on all these different areas. I think one of the areas that we'll be looking at tackling a lot more in the future is reducing the cost of nutrient-dense foods and also improving adoption of these foods by the vulnerable. Thank you for your attention.
This was fantastic. There's so much work going on in IFAS, and you're involved in a lot of those studies. I did want to mention that our next speaker next week here is on aquaculture.
Okay, great.
Salmon farming in Florida. Questions?
This is the second time this week I've heard about the eggs. It's very exciting, actually. I'm a biologist. My questions are about the eggs. Do they have a difficult time raising the chickens there? If not, or so, if you use a powdered egg, does it have the same nutrients available, and does that make it any easier to send it to them?
So that's a good question. The knowledge about poultry raising and egg production varies tremendously. So one of the biggest problems in the developing world is poor extension services. We have probably the best extension system in the world here, but that's not how it is in many places. So in the universities, they probably have a lot of information about the best ways to raise poultry, but a lot of farmers don't have access to that information. And so that's one of the reasons why we work with farmer cooperatives. We work to help them understand, because in our system here, our faculty are rewarded for doing extension. In many of those countries, they're not. So many of their faculty say, why should we bother? We're not rewarded for it. Now, on the other question about egg powder, yes, that's a very valid way of preserving the egg, but in many cases, it's not necessary. I think it's more important to encourage production, local production of the eggs, than sending them eggs from here. But an egg is a wonderful thing, because as long as the shell is intact, depending on how it is produced, that egg is going to remain relatively safe for an infant to consume if that egg is boiled or and so on. So We have a study that we're just starting in Rwanda this year, and in that case, we're boiling the eggs and giving them to pregnant women. The study I presented, eggs were given to infants. This time, the eggs are given to pregnant women because 20% of stunting happens in the uterus before the child is born.
There are other questions here?
I have a question. Pushpa, is that okay?
Zoom.
I'm just wondering, in the areas that you're working, is there available clean water, or is anyone providing for water for the animals, for the children?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Stunting is caused by not just poor nutrition, but also things like poor hygiene, water, sanitation, inadequacies, and so on. So in many cases, water is not hygiene. The water, it might be the same water in which people defecate, and so it might be replete with pathogens. So the water is also an area for attention and addressing to ensure that the water quality and the water safety is ensured.
I wanted to comment on growth, stunting growth in children. You showed that in India, I'm from India, that in India it's still very severe malnutrition, and so I suppose stunting is also there. You know, you see most Indians are short. And the one feature is that when we move to this country, our children keep getting taller and taller. It's not genetic, it's clearly nutrition.
Right.
My grandson is 6'3",
Yeah.
and look at me. They say, how did this happen? I said, it's not just genetics,
Yeah.
it's nutrition too over here. And I come from a middle-class family,
Yeah.
so, you know, it wasn't that. The other question I had was, when you did these studies with, say, providing an egg or providing just some nutrition, isn't there an ethical bias, ethical issue there, where you are having some controls, and if they are not getting it, those children are not getting it, they are going to be stunted for their whole life?
Yeah,
because
this is, it's a really important issue, and it's something we run into whenever we want to do any human subject studies. And so what we've often had to do is tell those in the control group that after the study, we will put them on the intervention. So
Is it not too late for them?
it's not, well, often it's not too late, and it's much better than what would have happened if they never
If they
got
didn't
it.
get it all, I see. Yeah, so you cross over
Right.
for the study.
Thank you, Paula. It's very nice. In terms of educating the mother and the kids in the school system, I can remember when I was forced to take castor oil, fish oil, terrible. My mother gave it to the Indians. It wasn't until I was 30, 40 years old that I realized that the fatty acids in there were so important. Yeah. But I was wondering, how much teaching is it for the kids directly as opposed to the mothers? I can remember when cafeterias in public schools just came in place in Maryland, for example. And you went there and you thought you were going there to be able to how to conduct yourself civilly in public in terms of a cafeteria and this kind of thing. But if the child knew, I don't know what the age of the break point is, but if the child's 6, 7 years old and you had a way of being able to educate them along with their mother, that would seem to me really increase the population that you're reaching in terms of the long term. I don't know whether there's any extension into the kids themselves directly coupled with the parents.
So there are some organizations that target the kids more so from an entrepreneurship standpoint. The challenge with targeting kids that old or that young with nutrition information is that what they eat, they have little say in what they eat, especially in these contexts. the it might be just an issue of what can be afforded. It can be an issue of a long-standing taboo that has been passed from generation to generation. So a 7-year-old, regardless of what they learn in school or what we tell them, is not going to be able to change that. And that's why with the egg study, we started with the village elders. If we didn't get them on board, we would have never got the success that we did. And so I think it's fine to have the children present when the mothers are being educated, but targeting the children alone, I think is going to have limited impact because they don't have a say on what they're eating. They don't really determine or dictate what they're eating. Targeting the women is much more effective than targeting the men. Although some of the latest research is showing that target the women, but make sure the men are in the room. Because the men still have, sway over the women. But the, interventions that target the women, whether they are focused on the diet or agricultural productivity, are usually much more effective, much more long-lasting than those that target the men.
Fantastic. We've had Dr. Sass, the president, come and speak here. And yesterday we had the provost speak to retired faculty, and now you. Each one of you has said how high the IFASs, the UF IFASs around the world, and it's all the work that it does. And hearing you today, I can see that IFAS is everywhere. I thought it was mostly Latin American countries. That's where you worked, but Africa and Asia too. So this is fantastic. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your coming out to give this talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The
you.
provost was with us in Nepal, and the president was with us in Rwanda a few months ago. So
Yes,
possible
they said that.
have-
They said probably you were with them. Yes, they mentioned that.
yes,
And
thank you.
they did mention you too. Yeah, thank you.